The Wizard Returns, Chapter 3. They walked through the pale blue fields for a long time, stopping briefly to eat some bread and cheese that Pete summoned out of thin air. "That's magic," Pete said. "Not like the flashy tricks you used to do." Their shadows lengthened on the grass. By now it was late in the afternoon. Pete occasionally squinted up at the sun as if gauging their direction, but when Hex asked him about it he only laughed. "This is Oz," he said. "The directions change all the time. I'm following the feel of the old magic. That's what's telling me where to go." Old magic? Pete didn't answer at first, and Hex thought he was ignoring the question, but after a moment he shrugged. "You really don't remember anything, do you? The old magic is the lifeblood of Oz, the power that runs through this place to keep it alive. It's like a huge web that connects everything together. The people, the landscape, the animals, the palace. Old magic flows through everything. Only the most powerful witches in Oz can tap into it. And the fairies, of course, because technically it's their magic. But I don't think they even truly understand how it works." The fairies who will be testing me?" Hex asked. "The fairies are the original citizens of Oz," Pete replied. Apparently, content to continue his history lesson. They were the ones who first crossed the Deadly Desert, long before Oz existed, and used their blood to give Oz its magic and bring life to the desert. They created Oz out of a wasteland. Because of that, the fairies are the rightful rulers of Oz. There have been other guardians of the thrones over the years, of course. Pete shot Hex an inscrutable look. But none of those rulers are legitimate, unless they've been authorized by the fairies. Anyway, if anyone can help you get home, it's the fairies." He put a strange stress on the word legitimate, and Hex wondered what he was getting on at. Fairies? Old magic? It all sounded like a bad Penny Dreadful. He frowned. Penny Dreadful. An image of a cheap, flimsy booklet, its cover printed in lurid colors, a fangled vampire leering over a clinging blonde girl in a low-cut dress. Something he'd once owned? He felt as though he were surrounded by a translucent but imperial wall. He could almost see through on the other side, where his old self awaited him in his real life, memories intact. But every time he tried to reach out, he crashed into a barrier as solid as glass. He had stopped walking, trying to remember, and Pete was watching him with an unreadable expression that almost seemed sympathetic, in contrast to his previous hostility. "It must be strange," Pete said, "not knowing who you are." Hex shrugged to keep hold of the memory, but it dissolved, again, into the blurry recesses of his mind. He felt almost queasy and realized blatantly that the strange sensation was shame. "I wasn't a very good person, was I?" he asked quietly. Pete looked surprised. "No," he said after a moment. "Not really." "Maybe it's better I don't remember," Hex said. "Maybe I should just start over." Pete's expression grew hard again. "Do you really think that's how it works? You forget all about the bad things you did and they just go away? The people you hurt will still remember. They have to—" Abruptly, Pete stopped, as if he just thought the better of what he had been about to say. "Get moving," he said gruffly. "We have a long way to go." The blue field gave way to rolling hills of flowers that moved like waves even though there was no wind, stretching all the way to the horizon on the other side. In front of them loomed an immense black forest, with trees so tall that even at the distance, Hex had to tilt his head all the way back to see where their inky tips speared the blue sky. As they drew closer, he saw that the trees grew closely together. They almost resembled a wall. The forest had an unmistakable air of menace. They were unmistakably headed directly for it. "You want us to go in there?" Hex asked, trying to keep his voice casual, and though Pete's back was to him, he could hear the sneer in Pete's response. "Don't like it? Too bad." After that, Hex resolved not to ask any more questions. His situation was bad enough without giving Pete any more opportunities to make him feel like a fool. Suddenly an ear-splitting howl echoed across the sea of flowers, and Hex saw half a dozen jagged black shapes bounding toward them, through the blossoms at a terrifying speed. Wolves, he thought, but like no wolves he's ever seen. They were twice as big, and from their brindled backs sprouted huge, leathery black bat wings that flapped madly as the animals raced toward them. Every so often one of the wolves would give its wings a tremendous pump, propelling itself several feet into the air and hurtling even more quickly toward them. "Wolves, run!" Pete yelled, and took off to the forest. Hex didn't need to be told twice. His throat closed up in terror and ran after Pete, but the wolves were gaining on them. They would never make the forest in time. Pete risked a glance backwards and stumbled. Hex, unable to stop his momentum, thumped into him, sending them both tumbling to the ground. Pete cursed aloud, and then the first of the wolves was upon them. Pete threw up his arms. A crackling curtain of purple energy sprang up to them. The wolf skidded to a halt, but too late. It crashed into Pete's magic wall and yelped frantically as its fur caught fire. Pete scrambled to his feet, dragging Hex up with him. The other wolves had stopped, eyeing the wall of magic wirily, but one of them was already going to push through, and Hex saw in horror that, rather than burning its snout, the wall was going to give. "That's not going to hold them," Pete gasped. "Come on." Hex was pretty sure he had never run so hard in his life. Of course, he couldn't remember, but it didn't seem likely. Behind him he heard a triumphant yip, and knew one of the wolves must have broken through Pete's spell. He put his arm down and pumped his legs harder. "Almost there," Pete said at his side. Dimly Hex realized that Pete had slowed down to match his pace, and then the wall of trees reared up before them. And Hex nearly crashed into one of the enormous trunks before Pete grabbed him and pushed him into a narrow opening between two trees. Up close the forest was more like a fortress. Huge trees loomed over them, sinister and forbidding, like an army of conjoined soldiers forming a hermetically sealed barricade. Hex struggled to squeeze through the trees. The wolves had reached them. Pete held them off with crackling sparks of magic, but they were too close. Pete could smell their awful, meaty breath and see the serrated edges of their huge fangs as they snarled. One leapt through the magical barrier, yowling but undeterred as its fur caught fire, and Hex hurled a rock at the wolf with all his might, hitting it squarely in the nose. It jumped back, growling. "Go!" Pete yelled, giving him one final shove. And with that, Hex popped through all the walls of the trees and tumbled to the ground on the far side. Pete heaved himself through the opening, after him landing on top of him as the trunk snapped together like a door slamming. First one, then several more disappointed howls roused up to the other side of the wall. Hex lay there, where he had fallen, gasping for breath. They had done it. They were safe. Something sharp jabbed him in the neck, and he looked up. A monkey loomed over him, dressed incuriously in a velvet jacket and neatly tailored velvet pants. A small red velvet fez with an ostentatious black tassel set a rakish angle on his head, and a pair of pince nez was perched on the end of his nose. The sight was so ridiculous that Hex would have laughed, except the monkey was holding a very serious-looking spear, and the business end of the spear was shoved up against Hex's throat. Hex turned his head just long enough to look for Pete. Maybe he had some idea what was going on. But Pete had vanished as if into thin air, leaving him alone with a crazed, overdressed monkey on the verge of impaling him. "Who the hell," the monkey said, "are you?"